Welcome to David Loyn, author of The Long War, the inside story of America and Afghanistan since 9/11. I'm Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, and this is the latest episode of Authors in Conversation, which is available on YouTube to watch and podcast to listen. David, welcome.
Thanks, Iain. Very good to be with you.
Great to have you. Now, you're an award-winning correspondent, foreign correspondent. 3 decades you spent at the BBC, and you know Afghanistan very well. When you see what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, to what extent do you think a leader like Putin, someone with a Putin-style mentality, would be encouraged by US failure in Afghanistan?
Well, I think a lot of people were saying last summer, Iain, and I think it has been sadly proved to be true, that the real sort of collapse, the disastrous collapse of American morale and the way that America really scuttled out of the war at the end would, give encouragement to other people in the world who might see that America was weak and really test the new president, President Biden. And of course, I think, whether Ukraine would have happened without that collapse from Afghanistan, we'll never know. But it's certainly the coincidence of one coming after another does show that none of these things can be seen completely in isolation.
Now, the long war. You were in Afghanistan. You were in Afghanistan before '96, but in '96 you were there when the Taliban took Kabul. This is a story that you tell in this book with very deep roots.
Well, I've certainly been focused on Afghanistan since I was correspondent based in India and South Asia in the mid-90s, and started going to Afghanistan a lot when the Taliban first emerged. And I was, of course, rather intrigued by this new movement who apparently were going to take the country and then did. And our crew were, in fact, the only international television crew with them when they took Kabul in 1996. But they couldn't govern successfully. And so 5 years later, the country, I think, was fairly glad to see the back of them. But what happened after 2001, which was potentially an easy hit for the United States and its allies, I think we've reaped the consequences of many of the mistakes that were made in the very early days of the American intervention. And if I could go through, from my point of view, you can look actually at December the 5th, 2001, at one single day in the intervention, right at the beginning of the American war, and see some of the mistakes that really led to the problems later on, and the reason why it became The Long War, the title of my book. Such a long intervention, America's longest war, NATO's longest war, and in the end, one that was, frankly, a military defeat. And on December the 5th, there was an American missile that nearly killed President Karzai, who's then just been nominated as the interim leader of the country. And in fact, only that morning, he was nominated interim leader by a summit in Bonn. And I think from that moment, Karzai knew that these smart bombs never really, some of them didn't quite go where you thought they were going to go. It killed 3 of the American soldiers who were supporting him and many of his own soldiers. So I think he had a sort of immediate mistrust. The other thing that happened that morning, apart from him being named the interim leader, was the Taliban coming to offer surrender terms to this new leader of the country. And that was very swiftly turned down by the American administration, by Bush's Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who wanted a victory. He didn't want any sense of a surrender, any conditions with the Taliban, although they didn't demand much. They just demanded, not to go to prison, to be able to return to their farms. They would accept disbanding the movement, removing their weapons, etc. They'd been defeated. And that was turned down by America. And I think that was a very significant mistake right at the beginning, because when instead America was backing these warlords, really, Afghan warlords, to try and defeat al-Qaeda, because America didn't put enough of its own troops on the ground, you then had the beginnings of the corruption, the millions of dollars that went into the pockets, frankly, of bandits, and without enough international security, and the Taliban still waiting in the wings, rebuffed by this surrender offer that had been turned down and chased and pursued by the Americans into the hills, you then have the recipe for the beginnings of what became a really difficult and slugging insurgency for many years to come.
But it was the period that you describe. It takes me back there. Of course, I was back in the UK working as a journalist, but the war in Afghanistan post 9/11, so that's only September. What you've just described there is December, so it's a very short period. I mean, at the time, I suppose there were several things going on in American policymakers' minds, weren't there? There was in the mind of a Rumsfeld who saw it in very ideological terms, this was something which had to be avenged, 9/11, and as you described it, wanted complete victory. Also, potentially, his mind and the mind of others was somewhere else, or they thought that there was another war that they might be fighting at some point in the next year or so. And there'd also been this strange. The war had unfolded in a way which made it look very easy, didn't it? Because the Americans used a combination of air power and intelligence and listening, plus then putting very few Americans on the ground initially and hooking up with locals, and it seemed to work. It seemed by December, it did seem as though the war was won.
Yeah, it was an illusion, though, Iain. And I remember, I mean, you mentioned the air power, and it was extraordinary. I remember being in the front line near at Charikar, not far north of Kabul, watching plane after plane, F-14s mostly that had come from warships off the coast, flying in this very, very carefully coordinated attacks. It was just like an air show, frankly. Absolutely no opposition as they destroyed the Taliban front line, which enabled America's allies on the ground to take Kabul very easily, and then ultimately to take Kandahar in the south. And I think there was that illusory sense that this was an easy victory, that the country had been defeated. And you mentioned the distraction of Iraq, which was already beginning to happen. And I write about it in the book. General Tommy Franks, who's then the commander of CENTCOM, the overall commander of the American-led operation, he is asked to produce a war plan for Iraq even before the whole of Afghanistan was fallen in December of 2001. And of course, what they were trying to do, the main object of the war, of course, was to find, kill, or capture Osama bin Laden. And the light footprint, the very small number of American troops on the ground, failed even in that toughest of tests. And a couple of weeks after the incident I described, where President Karzai was nearly killed at the beginning of December, and the Taliban offered to surrender, a couple of weeks after that, there was the siege, effectively, of the Tora Bora cave complex in the mountains, where Osama bin Laden was known to be holed up. Now, the US had 3,500 Marines available on board ship, 1,000 of them by now on shore, but not being used as troops. And their commander, Jim Mattis, who was later, of course, US Defense Secretary, was screaming in what he described, fairly earthy terms on the phone to CENTCOM to say, "Send in my boys into this Tora Bora battle." But again, Rumsfeld very keen not to use American troops in that kind of operation. They financed unreliable local militias, gave lots and lots of money to some pretty corrupt people, and Osama bin Laden escaped the Battle of Tora Bora. So it took another 10 years to actually track down and finally kill him. So even in its own terms, the American light footprint, this not putting enough troops on the ground in Afghanistan, failed. And I think it set the terms by which this became such a difficult and complex conflict.
It's fascinating what you just described there. Of course, that's a major turning point in the conflict, isn't it? And it could have been more neatly tied up with if bin Laden had been captured or killed in the battle you described, but he gets away. And then the Taliban start to re-emerge. And
yes, it took them 2 or 3 years before corruption really took hold. And the corruption began because these wretched warlords had been re-empowered by the Americans. So from the very beginning, the democratic project was quite hard to embed in Afghanistan. And there were commanders on the ground, McCall, who was the British commander in Kabul, and other Americans who were saying, we only need 25 or 30,000 troops. They weren't talking about a huge force in order to provide some sense of stabilization, some sense of security for Afghanistan, because the Taliban forces had, of course, disappeared, and there wasn't, the basic security that the country needed. It didn't need very much in terms of the numbers of troops, but by 2002, 2003, the kind of money that began to come in, because at the same time as the light footprint and we're not going to do anything in Afghanistan, there's certainly no nation building. There's very strong sense from the United States that they weren't there to create a new nation in Afghanistan. At the beginning, that was what they were planning not to do. At the same time as that, there was this other sort of sense in the Bush White House, and I think in President Bush's mind himself, of American exceptionalism, of the ability to build and spread democracy abroad. He made a rather curious speech in 2002, evoking the Marshall Plan, the plan to rebuild Germany and parts of Western Europe after World War II, and saying, we need a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan. So, of course, billions of dollars began to flow into the country, but without proper security and without accountability for it, and without a bigger doctrine. And I think that's the argument that I make in the book. The sort of the point that I really want people to take away from this book is that we lacked then, and we still lack, an intervention doctrine that pulls together the different strands: defense, diplomacy, development, the 3 Ds, if you like, pulls together the capacity to put the right number of troops on the ground, the right inputs into development funding, and the right kind of political thinking in order to go into these kinds of interventions. But instead, it's all improvised, and Afghanistan was really the proof that you can't improvise these things because they're very, very hard to do.
And it's strange, isn't it? And it comes across very clearly in the book, the way in which it is, as you said, that contradiction between the Rumsfeld approach, which was it cynical? Was it, some of the neocons were ultimately maybe even too, as in their own terms, idealistic. They sort of believed that if you just created these conditions, there'd be this flowering in under liberty, there'd be something would magically emerge. But then Bush realizes, maybe too late or a couple of years into it, that huge amounts of money is needed. But that is then channeled, as you described, to the warlords, really for reasons of realpolitik, isn't it? It's just that's the cheapest or the easiest route to try and get some sort of control without a huge footprint on the ground.
Yes, and by then, you don't have any other sorts of security in order to be able to manage the funding, and you don't have the development thinking that can stop the money being abused, frankly. And the military began to have one of the other things that happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it happened oddly because there was a huge amount of money, several $1 million discovered, bricked up in a house near Baghdad in Iraq a couple of years after the Afghan war began. Of course, there was the Iraq war, and this money was discovered. And Bush said, "Well, this must be Iraq's money. We can't spend it." And the money went through the military. It was spent by the military, and this became the beginnings of Commanders of Emergency Response Programs, CERT programs, so that by the middle of the Afghan war, by 2008, 9, 10, the military in Afghanistan are spending more money than the development professionals on projects. And of course, they're wanting quick impact on the ground. And the development professionals are sitting back and saying, this doesn't work. You need to do much more longer term work. You need to do more infrastructure development, more development of the government, of systems within the government. Some of that was happening, but so much money was flowing through these rather unaccountable quick impact projects from from the US military, that by 2011, 2012, and this is sort of the worst moment in the war, you had some very interesting investigations that discovered that effectively, because by now you had around about 150,000 troops, 100,000 of them American, 50,000 from more than 30 other countries, a huge force in Afghanistan, the light footprint, no more, to get food and fuel and ammunition and all the other things that army needed into the country involved vast convoys of vehicles coming into the country, and a lot of them crossed territory that was frankly held by the Taliban, and they paid danger money in order not to be shot at, protection money to the Taliban effectively. So you had, by the middle of the war, you had the Taliban being funded by tens of millions of dollars in order to supply the army that had settled in the country.
Now, the book is, it tells the entire story, but it is, at the heart of it, it's in large part a study of military leadership, and you interview a lot of the key participants. I know it's difficult to generalize because they all have their own take, but what really went wrong, do you think, at root?
Well, it was one of those situations, Ian. It's a bit like, surgeons say the operation was successful, but the patient died. And, there was nothing that the military did wrong. They never lost a tactical engagement. There were some occasions when the Taliban killed 9 soldiers, overran, forward operating bases, but quickly that ground was taken back. And so in military terms, it was broadly a success, but the strategy was wrong, and the surrounding issues that were there were wrong. So, and there was also, I think, the other challenge that they faced throughout was constantly being. Now, this sounds odd to put it like this, second guessed by politicians, but of course, because of course politicians are, the people who are declaring why they should be there and what they should do when they get there. But I think we saw this particularly with Stanley McChrystal in 2009, when the Obama administration came in. He was very skeptical of the war. He pulled out of Iraq, of course, and spent most of 2009 fascinating series of meetings. I interviewed a lot of people who were in the White House at the time, talking about these meetings that they had. Gates, who was his defense secretary by then, holdover defense secretary from the Bush administration, remained for the Obama administration. Bob Gates said that more executive time, senior executive time, was spent on Afghanistan than any other single foreign policy issue in the first year of the Obama administration, which means the president himself, a dozen or so meetings. And at the end of the year, Stan McChrystal had his plan, but it didn't have the number of troops that McChrystal wanted in order to be able to do the job. And I think, so you saw politicians saying, this is what we need you to do. And the generals saying, this is the size of force that we need in order to do that task. And Obama in particular saying, you can't have that many, you can have only 2/3 of that. And by the way, they're leaving by next year. So there was a strong reluctance on the part of the Obama White House to commit to the war with anything like the long-term, withdrawal based on conditions, not on a timetable, which is what the generals wanted. And from 2009, 10, 11, 12, you had this timetable withdrawal of surge troops leaving almost as soon as they'd arrived. And, quite a sort of turnover of Americans. But, by then, there are beginning to be some real successes on the ground. And in terms of the British intervention, for example, very weak at the beginning, the first 3 or 4 years in Helmand province, because they didn't have enough troops. Huge numbers of American Marines poured into Helmand in 2009-10, and the British were contained into a smaller area just south of the capital, Ashraf Ghani, and really began to make an impact. By the election of 2014, I was walking around villages, without body armor, without protected armored vehicles, covering the election, because in areas which only 3 or 4 years had been hotly contested shooting matches with British soldiers holding ground. So it did make a difference. Having that many troops in terms of the military on the ground did make a difference by 2014, but it was always going to end. They were pulling out almost as soon as they arrived, and in the end, the saying was that the Taliban used to have this saying, "You may have a watch, but we have the time." And at the end of the day, the Taliban just waited it out long enough in order to be able to begin to take more ground as the troops pulled out, so that certainly by 2019, when peace talks really began under President Trump with the Taliban, by then they're holding about a third of the Afghan countryside.
And did you feel in 2014, as you described there, walking around covering the election, but did you feel, you knew that the surge would end eventually, but did you feel some sort of hope? Was there a possibility of things going in the right direction for the Afghans?
Yes, and I think, the other point I'd make, Iain, is that although it was a military defeat, by 20 years later, by 2021, when the withdrawal happened in such a disastrous way, as the Americans and their allies just scuttled out of the country, although it's a military defeat, what was left behind was a completely different country from the country that the Americans had come into in 2001. The 5 years of the Taliban government from 96 to 2001, nothing was built, nothing happened. There was no, development at all. They were very bad in terms of government, as they've been proved to be since they've come back in the last 6 months. But the society that was left behind was a very different society with different expectations from their parents, much more developed, many more people living in cities, many more smartphones, of course, a very young society. Most Afghans have been born since 9/11. They don't know anything about, the arcane knowledge of the sort of civil war of the earlier years. And that society is a very different sort of place. I think it wasn't, if you like, a social defeat. It wasn't a complete disaster, the intervention in Afghanistan. And I would urge policymakers now to really try and support that society. If there's anything we can do to support Afghan media, to support Afghan women's groups, to support the civil society and build resilience for that society because of the shock of the Taliban takeover. So it wasn't all a disaster. It wasn't a defeat in the broader terms, the Afghan war, but it certainly has left a really difficult challenge for the militaries who were engaged there, and some of those senior people who I was talking to for the book, and I've been in touch with since the book came out, and one of them said to me, he just spends so much time anguishing, really, that we didn't do as well as the Russians. How could we not have done as well as the Russians, whose government lasted 3 years after they pulled out in 1989, after their Afghan war? Well, the American-backed government of President Ghani didn't last 3 hours after the last American helicopter left the embassy in August last year.
And you saw it from the other side as well, or you saw it from a different perspective, which you describe in the book, in that you're a reporter on the ground, but then also when you retired from the Beeb in 2015, you then also, you worked as an advisor, so you saw it from a different angle. What was that like?
It was absolutely fascinating, Iain, working in government. You're a journalist, and you, as a journalist, you sort of have your nose pressed up against the window the whole time, wondering what's going on inside. And, we'll have contacts and discuss what's going on inside governments. But actually being in the room was intriguing. It was, I was communications advisor to the president's team in some quite interesting meetings, drafting some speeches, engaging, helping his team to engage journalists, helping him to engage journalists, and really seeing from a personal point of view, seeing how government works from the inside was intriguing. And of course, one of the challenges that I could see him facing and never really quite overcoming, because of the political challenges I think that he faced in terms of his own capacities, but also in terms of the situation he was facing, which is a very corrupt country, was this nascent reform movement, trying to build reformers, trying to encourage and recruit and appoint. He leapfrogged the older generation and appointed lots of people in their 30s. The UN ambassador was 29 years old, young woman, went to the UN. So he was sending a sort of new face of a different kind of Afghanistan out into the world. But of course, those individuals faced enormous challenges inside the administration. And I saw really good reformers having their legs cut off by people who were stealing money. And it was rather sort of intriguing to see quite how difficult it is to do government, frankly.
Do you think it could have been different? Was there another way to fight and to win and to handle the politics?
Yes, I think once we've made those mistakes in December 2001 and into 2002, not talking to the Taliban, not having enough security on the ground, putting in unaccountable cash, not holding the warlords to account, but instead, putting them back into positions. Once those mistakes had been made, I think it was going to be, the Afghan war was going to be really, really difficult to win. And so it proved. It's a very, very complex country. And those of us I've spent, as you say, more than 25 years going in and out of Afghanistan pretty well every year. And, living there for 3 or 4 years of that time. And I don't know anything about it. I mean, it's those of us who go there, you realise just quite how complicated this whole thing is. So I think it could have been different. It would have been really difficult, but absent an intervention doctrine and a sense of how we might do these things better and political agreement among us, a group of allies, to, if we're going to do interventions, then having a modus operandi, having a way of doing them that we all agree to. That I think, absent that, it was never going to be very easy. And you mentioned, I interviewed all of the commanders, the senior commanders of the military operation during the key combat phase, 2006 to 14, and you don't get to be a 4-star general in the British or American armies without being a really impressive player. And they were big-brained, sophisticated political animals. But by then, scratching their heads at really whether they could make a difference and move this in the right direction.
What happens now, do you think? It's a country you know well. The retreat was a disaster. We can see there's a humanitarian crisis unfolding, although the world is distracted with other things at the moment, and Afghanistan's not getting all that much attention. But it is a humanitarian catastrophe. What happens next?
Well, as you speak, this week, the Taliban, Taliban 2.0, as people like to say, is this going to be a different Taliban to the Taliban in the 1990s? And up to now, they haven't really cracked down really significantly on some of the social issues. But as we speak this week, there have been a number of really retrograde things that the Taliban have done, which shows that that the Kandahari Taliban, the old guard, the more traditional, Pashtuns from the south, are now beginning to have the upper hand in government. So they were going to open girls' schools for the Afghan New Year, which was in the 21st of March. And in fact, the day that the schools were due to open, the announcement was made that they were going to open. They didn't open. So, you had thousands of girls coming to school, with their uniforms on, with their books in their hands, whose hopes were dashed. So the schools have been closed. Women are now prevented from really travelling outside the home without a male guardian, a muharram, so-called. And women on their own are not allowed to travel out of the country without a muharram. And we just heard this week that men without beards or turbans are no longer going to be able to work in government. So these rather, obsessional desires to control social behavior of both men and women, which they did in the late 1990s, are beginning to come back with the Taliban. And of course, they're not very big. They only have perhaps 75,000 troops across the whole of the country. And given the potential insecurity, that's nothing like enough. If there is going to be more restlessness in the countryside, and we're already beginning to see some sort of small insurgencies in parts of the country, disaffected northern commanders in particular turning against them. And I think during the so-called fighting season, it's beginning to get warm now. The snows have disappeared from the mountains. During the summer of this year and on into the autumn, I think they're going to begin to face far more challenges from insurgents against their government. So, I'm afraid the war in Afghanistan may not be over.
And what you described there is, it's almost then going back to the politics pre 9/11. You mentioned the Northern Alliance there, which of course it was the murder by Al Qaeda of the Northern Alliance commander that was the trigger or was the signal that 9/11 was going to happen. So you think that there's the possibility there of resistance emerging, and what you're describing there is sort of years of partisan warfare.
I'm afraid that may be the loss of Afghanistan, and the Northern Alliance are just one of the groups. There are Uzbek groups as well. General Dostum's forces beginning to perhaps reassemble, and there's also the former Afghan National Army, which feels that it was let down by the Americans last summer. And in contrast to Ukraine, it's very interesting watching quite how much logistical and software and all that other support that the Ukrainian forces are getting from the United States and from other countries as they fight against the Russian invasion. All of those kinds of enablers were removed by America from the Afghan National Army, and it became increasingly demoralized during the spring of last year as the Taliban was moving across the countryside, and things like contractors who were keeping their helicopters flying, software in order for them to be able to communicate with their own troops, were all removed by American contractors as the American withdrawal began to gather pace. So those soldiers I've talked to some of their commanders who are now in exile in the West, want another crack. They feel that they want to defend the Afghan Republic against the Taliban. And frankly, the more of these social restrictions that the Taliban impose on people, the more the less good government they manage to provide in the country, then I think we're going to see far more instability.
Well, thank you, David Loyn. It sounds as though the long war is far from over, and the long war, which is David's book, which we're discussing, I would recommend that all policymakers who are dealing with the next phase of what's happening in Afghanistan, and anyone else who's interested in the subject, who should be, reads this book, The Long War, The Inside Story of America and Afghanistan Since 9/11 by David Loyn. Thank you for joining us today, David.
Really good to be with you, Ian. Thanks.
Great to see you. You've been watching Authors in Conversation with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube and you're watching this on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button, or you may be listening to us on the podcast. And if you're not a subscriber to Reaction and you want access to the site and my weekly newsletter and all of the great work from our team, the details are below. Until next time, thank you for listening.